I have this one weird memory of being in 4th or 5th grade, and everyone in our class doing some kind of math-related presentation during a field trip to our local mall. I know that sounds ridiculous, and it was, and for the life of me, I can't remember what exactly this thing was supposed to be. There were kids from other schools there, and I think this had something to do with the national message like the year of math in schools. I guess you could think of this as a science fair for math, but with a lot less preparation required, and no one getting judged aside from our teacher grading our presentations. Each of us had to choose a topic from a list that our teacher, Mrs. Glenn, had come up with, then make a poster and a brief presentation about it. I remember I chose twin primes, which are prime numbers that are two numbers away from each other. For instance, 3 and 5, or 17 and 19. Our mall was on the smaller side, and it was all on one level. A lot of the shops had either been replaced with office-type businesses, or else they had just been left vacant. And since we were going in the middle of a weekday, I knew the place would basically be deserted aside from the other people participating in this event. However, this event turned out to be huge, and when we arrived around 10, there were already like 10 other school buses there. There were about 20 kids in our class, along with Mrs. Glenn and I think 2 parent chaperones. As we filed off the bus, I tried not to let my rolled up poster with the rubber band around it get crumpled. I'd sat next to my best friend Jeremy, and he did the same. When we got near the entrance, we saw someone apparently from a TV station setting up equipment, and when we looked inside, we saw the mall was already packed with kids from other schools. Our class had started talking loudly, and Mrs. Glenn was trying to shout over us and give us directions. She told us to follow her to our designated area, and then get 2 pieces of sticky tack and find a place to hang up our poster. Apparently our designated area was on the exact opposite end of the mall, because we had to walk all the way down the main hallway while trying to push other kids out of the way. I'll spare a lot of the nerdy details, but some kids went all out for this, even dressing up in suits and stuff. I didn't recognize anyone outside of our class, so they either came from further away or possibly from nearby private schools. Finally we got to our area, which was this place with benches and a few tables and chairs in front of one of the bigger stores that had left. Mrs. Glenn set her stuff down and had each of us get some tack. After Jeremy and I walked up and got our tack, we instinctively went to this square pillar near one of the corners. I put my poster up on one side, and Jeremy put his up on the other side. It wasn't like I was super nervous about giving my presentation, because I felt I did a decent job. I just didn't like the idea of random people asking me questions and having to make small talk. The idea that I might also somehow get on TV freaked me out a bit as well. Thankfully, this end of the building was less crowded, and the people that did come by, many of whom were teachers, only greeted us and asked 1 or 2 quick questions. Aside from short bathroom breaks, we needed to stay at our posters until 11:30, at which time lunch would be provided by some kind of catering organization. Then after that, we'd have time to check out the work from the kids from other schools before eventually getting back on our bus. Being right next to Jeremy and talking to him made the time go by quicker, but I still got tired of standing after a while and eventually started to get hungry. Finally, it was like 11:15 and I was in the home stretch when another person walked up to my poster. Unlike the teachers and parent chaperone type people who'd walked by me before, this person immediately struck me as odd. He was this overweight 40-year-old guy in a red sweatshirt and gray sweatpants, and something about the way he looked around as he walked creeped me out. At first I wasn't even sure if he intended to ask me a question, so though we made eye contact, I didn't greet him. It felt like he just stood there 5 feet away from me for about a minute, and it was extremely awkward. Finally, he appeared to ask a question, but he spoke so softly I had to ask him to repeat himself. Then he smiled and I heard him say, "Hey Paul," which was my name. Now, our names were on our posters, but it still seemed like such a weird way to start a conversation about my project. I was completely sure I didn't know this guy from anywhere, so I assumed he wanted to talk about my poster. I tried to be as polite as possible without sounding weirded out, so I greeted the man and asked if he had any questions. The man initially said no, still barely audible, but then took a step closer and started reading my poster. Like 30 seconds later he asked, "So what's the prime number?" I started to get annoyed, since that meant I'd have to give a longer explanation to this creepy guy while I was getting more tired and more hungry. I think I started telling him how prime numbers were positive whole numbers that were only divisible by 1 in themselves, but the man actually cut in and said, "But your project is on twin primes." Now that made me upset. The guy could just stand by me for several minutes and make things awkward and ask me a question, but couldn't listen for more than 10 seconds when I was trying to explain. I tried my best to control myself as I told him that twin primes were a type of prime number. To that, the man just said, "Oh," and continued to stand there. 30 seconds or so passed, and I wasn't sure if he was still reading the poster or not. I finally asked him, "Do you have some more questions?" The man just stood there squinting for a moment, but what he asked me next caught me completely off guard. In that same quiet voice, he asked when we were breaking for lunch. I was completely taken aback and instinctively looked around for Jeremy or Mrs. Glenn or a chaperone. Jeremy had been talking to this random kid who'd walked up to his poster a few minutes ago, but he wasn't there now, and I think he'd gone with one of the chaperones on a bathroom break. I kept looking but couldn't find Mrs. Glenn or either of the chaperones. Therefore, I turned back to the man, who was looking directly at me, and told him, "I don't know," while trying to keep my composure. Then the guy had the nerve to laugh, like I was too stupid to remember my schedule or something, when in reality I just wanted this conversation to have been over 5 minutes ago. But the worst part was he kept waiting there, as if he expected me to figure something out and give him a better answer. I was done. I looked the man right in the eye without saying anything, and finally, like 10 seconds later, he made some kind of expression and rolled his eyes and walked away. I watched him as he slowly made his way down the hallway, past where another class was set up, without apparently stopping to ask anyone else any questions. My blood was boiling as I forced myself to just keep standing there as he faded from view. Then, as if on cue, Jeremy and another one of our classmates came walking back over a moment later. Jeremy must have sensed something was wrong, because he asked me what happened. I told him about the creepy dude, and maybe because of how I was acting when he walked up, Jeremy seemed to believe what I told him. I asked if he had seen that guy since we got to the mall, and Jeremy said no, which wasn't surprising, since we had basically been chatting with each other since we got here. Finally, Mrs. Glenn made the announcement that we could take down our posters, and many members of our class started cheering. We eagerly started prying up the pieces of tack and rolling up our posters, as Mrs. Glenn told us to bring back the tack and get one of the boxed lunches that had just been delivered. Our class stayed in the same area, and after getting our lunches, Jeremy and I sat down on 2 of the benches with a couple other guys from our class. 5 or so minutes into lunch, Jeremy nudged me and said, "Dude, is that him?" I looked over and saw that man, standing by one of the pillars about 30 feet from where we were sitting. Our eyes met, and the man immediately ducked back out of view. The other kids we were sitting with started laughing, as neither Jeremy nor I had mentioned that guy in the conversation, and they weren't aware of how creepy he'd been around me. Maybe they thought I knew him or something, but before I could explain, I saw that guy walk quickly out from the other side of the pillar, straight to the table that had the food on it, and then turn 90 degrees and come right towards me. I think Mrs. Glenn actually took notice of him, but before she could say anything, he literally walked right up to me and then grabbed my shoulders. I instinctively started punching the man, and after about the 3rd punch, he let go. Then at that same speed, he kept moving to the door and left, never to be seen by us again. The encounter was so short and unexpected that almost no one realized I was just attacked. I think Mrs. Glenn thought he was one of my relatives and we were roughhousing, because when she came over and Jeremy and I explained that we didn't know him, she started freaking out. She yelled at one of the parents to contact security while she herself got on the phone with someone. Mrs. Glenn stayed right with me, and within a few minutes 2 security guards showed up, and then a few minutes later actual cops started showing up. Eventually I could hear gasps and fear in people's voices coming from down the hallway, and it was such a big scene. We got back on the bus, and when we got back to our school, our parents were already waiting for us. My mom was hysterical when she saw me. Honestly, I didn't even really know what to feel. It was also surreal. I'd given a statement to one of the cops at the mall, and no one from the police department ever contacted me again, so I guess they never caught the guy. I felt bad for Mrs. Glenn, since she seemed a bit more anxious after that. Ultimately, I hope that whoever that was got caught before he could kidnap or harm someone, or else decided not to try. I don't think about what happened too often, but I can't help but wonder, what was that man planning to do to me? I was a big nerd as a kid, and I still am one as an adult, and the premise of this story is sure to nerd some people out. There's this organization called the Great Internet Mersenne Prime Search, where people can run this program called Prime 95 to look for a new world record length prime number. The newer and faster your computer's processor is, the faster Prime 95 can determine whether a number is prime or not, and it can move on to checking the next number after that. I'll skip over more of the details. Basically, I was a 14-year-old kid trying to see how far my allowance and other money would go in getting new hardware. Our local mall had a Radio Shack where I'd go to check out the new computers. Ultimately, I never ended up using my money to buy anything, though I think going there convinced my parents I knew a lot about computers, and I persuaded them to get a slightly more expensive PC with a better processor when we replaced our old Packard Bell system. Sometimes I'd go to the mall with my mom, and other times I'd go there with some of my friends. On one particular day, my mom forced me to go with her to get some new clothes, which was an activity I really didn't enjoy. We spent about an hour in JCPenney, and finally got a few pairs of new jeans and longer shirts and a new jacket for the cooler weather. We had to go back to our house for dinner, but before going, I convinced my mom to let us stop by Radio Shack. So we walked over there, and I began inspecting the 10 or so computers they had on display. I'm pretty sure they were all compacts. Just then my mom remembered she had to get this gift for one of her friends, and we agreed that I could stay at the Radio Shack as long as I didn't leave. Then she left to go to the Macy's, I think, which was on the other side of the mall. I started reading the specs of one of the new desktops, which had a Pentium 4 with hyperthreading, and immediately got curious about the idea of running 2 instances of Prime 95 at the same time. I became completely engrossed, and maybe a minute or two passed before I noticed this older woman was standing right next to me. I assumed she was looking at the same computer, since it was the only one on this little stand, but when I turned, I was shocked to see she was looking right at me. When our eyes met, she smiled, but there was something off about her that made it come across as completely creepy. The lady looked to be in her 40s and was dressed in a blazer and jeans. I assumed she worked at the store and was going to give me a sales pitch, but she just stood there, smiling at me. I was already a pretty introverted person, so this was sheer agony. Finally, after what seemed like 10 minutes, she said, "And how are you doing today?" Something about how she said that was off-putting as well. The lady had a bit of a lisp and some kind of accent. I looked away and said, "I'm fine," in a soft voice. Another huge amount of time passed, and then she asked me, "So do you like that computer?" To that I said something like, "Yeah, it's cool." The lady next asked me, "So what would you do with it?" I told her I'd run some programs. I was too shy to say I wanted to be left alone, and I was dying inside waiting for her to leave. Then the lady told me there was a raffle and I could possibly win it. A lot of my discomfort actually evaporated as I became more curious. I asked her where I could sign up, and she looked around the room. She told me that they had apparently run out of the paper forms, and that she needed to go get more. But then she said that if I went with her and helped her get them, I could put my name in several times. I asked the lady where the extra forms were. She looked around the room again, and then told me they were in the back. I began walking with her past a few displays with TVs and stereos before she abruptly stopped. She even put out her arm to stop me from walking forward. I was confused, but picked up on the fact that there was an employee behind the counter near a hallway, which I assumed led to the back part of the store. I thought the woman was just going to ask him to get the forms, but instead, some other guy in jeans and a plaid shirt walked over and asked the employee for help with something. The employee got up from where he was sitting and came out around the corner, after which the lady looked around again and then started leading me forward. The realization of what was most likely going on hit all at once. I told the lady I wasn't interested anymore, but she only took hold of my arm and kept leading me to that back hallway. I started saying, "Let me go," progressively louder, and eventually the woman let go abruptly and ran into the hallway. The employee who had gotten up a minute earlier, along with 2 other people, walked back to where we had been standing, and he asked me in a concerned tone if I was alright. I started to explain about the woman, but just then there was a commotion in the front of the store. Apparently the man in the plaid shirt who had asked the employee for help had sprinted out of the front entrance and knocked something over. By now it was obvious that the woman didn't actually work in the store, and that she and the man were working together to try to abduct me. I assumed they were just looking for any kid, and not me specifically. I started crying while another employee came over, and eventually a mall cop. Then right before they were going to make an announcement, my mom actually walked back through the entrance. She immediately freaked out when she saw the employees and a few other people standing around me. When I told her about how the woman was leading me to the back of the store, she lost it and started screaming at me that I shouldn't have gone anywhere with her but gotten help immediately. Really though, I don't think she was angry, just terrified at the thought that I was almost abducted. Eventually a cop showed up and I answered some of his questions. We ended up going home like an hour later, and when my mom filled my dad in on what happened, he got emotional as well. My parents didn't say much during dinner, but we had a long talk after that about how to handle various stranger danger type situations. Overall, I don't think my parents blamed me too much, as I didn't actually leave the store, and I got help pretty quickly when that lady was trying to take me to the back hallway. Ultimately, they never caught those 2 people, at least as far as I know. I don't think about this memory super often, but it does pop up every now and then, and I can't help but wonder what those people would have done to me if I hadn't gotten away. My name is Tony, and when I was in the 8th grade, I went with two of my friends Jeff and Ping to this indoor go-kart track at our local mall. It took the place of one of the larger clothing stores that left, and now there was this big concrete area in the middle with rubber dividers and tape on it. We decided to go in the middle of a weekday that we had off of school for some reason. We did that so it wouldn't be busy, and when we arrived, we were the only ones there. The rest of the mall was pretty deserted as well. There was an area with a counter on one side of the track, and when we walked over, this guy asked us to fill out some waivers. The dude was in his 20s and was pretty buff, and he was like 6'4" and had a couple tattoos. Surprisingly, he had a somewhat soft voice. After we finished filling out the waivers, each of us paid $10, which would let us ride for an entire hour. Then the guy had us walk over to one corner of the area with a bench and a whiteboard. He gave us a quick safety lesson and handed us each a helmet. Then we walked over to where the go-karts were in a little corral off to the side. We started the carts and drove them onto the main track and lined them up on the starting line. The guy counted us down and then we took off. We had decided to race 10 laps and each of us took things relatively slow in the beginning. By the 3rd lap or so, we had started to speed up and occasionally hit some of the rubber dividers by the curved areas. Jeff, Ping, and I yelled to each other as we raced, and we had a lot of fun. Though Ping was behind me and Jeff in the beginning, he managed to catch up to us and even lap Jeff by the time we got to the final lap. After the race, we parked the carts and I walked back over to the counter where the dude was sitting. I asked him if we could go and come back later to use the remainder of our time. I'm not sure if that was official policy, but the dude was cool with it. I told Jeff and Ping and we decided to get something at the food court. We did another 10-lap race after we came back and still had a half hour of time left. As we'd been racing for a while, there was no one else to race with. Jeff, Ping, and I were kind of getting tired of the go-karts. We decided to walk around the mall and visit some other stores before coming back and doing one last race. But first I had to use the restroom, so I asked the guy where it was and he directed me to one of the hallways at the back. I told Jeff and Ping I'd catch up to them and they left. Then I walked around the edge of the track to this hallway and looked inside, and it was actually a little bit creepy. The hallway was pretty narrow, like 30 feet long with plain white walls and ceiling tiles. All the lights were off, so it was hard to see the other end. I tried finding a light switch, but couldn't, so maybe these lights had to be turned on at the counter, I don't know. I just walked down it and noticed 2 doors, the first of which was closed. I walked inside to find a decently clean bathroom, and after doing my business, I came back out. Here is where my curiosity got the better of me, inadvertently leading to a terrifying experience. As I walked into the hallway, I couldn't help but notice the room inside the open door, or rather, what was inside it. Like in the hallway, the lights were all off, but I noticed these dimly glowing logos which I soon realized were from screensavers. I tiptoed closer and stood in the doorway and took a few steps inside. There were like 6 computers in there, which appeared to be on tables lining the room. There was a hum from the cooling fans, and it was rather warm in there. It made no sense to me why there would be this completely darkened room full of computers in the back of a go-kart place in a mall. I started to suspect the go-karts were all a front for some kind of undercover police operation or hacking group, and my blood ran cold. I decided the best thing to do would be to walk back the way I came and play it off like I didn't notice what was in that room. But before I could even leave, I heard footsteps. I looked around the corner to see the silhouette of that man walking slowly down the hallway. I wasn't sure if he saw me or not, and my mind was racing. Somehow I found the courage to walk back into the hallway and pretend I just went into the wrong room. I tried not to look the man in the eye, but when he saw me step into the hallway, he asked me if I found the bathroom. To my horror, I blurted out yes instead of no. The man stopped like 4 feet away from me and very matter-of-factly asked, "Did you see what was in that room?" Now my mind went blank, and I just stood there. I could only see the guy's silhouette, so I couldn't make out his facial expression, but he told me in a very calm voice to come with him to the room. I contemplated screaming, but Jeff and Ping were gone and there was no one else here. I doubt I could have made it past him either, since this hallway was only like 5 feet wide. Instead, I did my best to retain my composure and walk back into the room while sliding my hand into my pocket and getting my phone ready. The dude was right behind me, and when he came in, he flipped a switch inside the room and the overhead lights came on. 4 long wooden tables with desktop computers came into view, along with chairs, a recliner, TV, and mini fridge. The man walked past me and sat down in the chair in front of one of the computers and motioned for me to sit down next to him. I knew I could either make a break for the door or sit down, and I was this close to running, but I was reasonably sure this guy could catch me. So I sat down and crossed my legs, at the same time pulling my phone out and putting it in my lap. Just then the guy spoke and said, "Relax, dude." I stared at him with his blank expression, trying to get a read on him. Then he told me that other people get curious about this room, so he tells them about it. He proceeded to move the mouse attached to his computer, which brought up a lock screen, and he typed in the password. "Have you ever heard of Prime Grid?" he asked me. I had no idea what that was, so I shook my head no. Then the man asked me if I knew what prime numbers were, and I nodded my head. Then the guy began explaining how you can run these programs that search for prime numbers, and if you find one, you can get on this worldwide list of the biggest 5,000 known prime numbers. He told me there was this platform called Boink, and you could run different projects within it. By this time, I had unlocked my phone and brought up our group text, but hadn't sent a message to Jeff and Ping yet. The guy motioned for me to come closer to see what was on the screen, and I ducked my phone back into my pocket and pulled the chair over. Indeed, there was a window that said Boink Manager, and a list of what I guessed were prime numbers that were being checked. Slowly, I felt my body relax as I considered it less likely this was some undercover operation. I pulled my phone out again and texted that I was hanging out with that guy in one of the back rooms of the go-kart place. Jeff and Ping thought I was messing with them, but I told them to come back and check it out for themselves. Ultimately, they came back and we all hung out in that room for like an hour before we had to go. The guy, whose name was Ben, was actually pretty cool, and we had a bro chat and shared some of the sodas from the fridge. We even had a mini LAN party on the computers. Ben told us how he was working at the go-kart place part-time to make money in college, and explained how he built up this small collection of used computers to run math and science projects on as a hobby. I honestly wouldn't have expected a guy like him to be a secret nerd, but I guess looks can be deceiving. Eventually we had to go, and thanked him very much for the sodas and letting us hang out. As 3 8th graders, we were pretty stoked to have made a cool older buff dude as a friend, and definitely planned to come back another time. 2 weeks later, Ping and I went back on a Friday night, and this time the place was packed. There were 3 other employees at the counter area, and when we walked up, we asked if Ben was there. The employees immediately looked sad, and Ping and I started to worry. One of them, an older lady, pulled us aside, and we walked over to a less crowded area. Then she said in a low voice that Ben had gotten sick. Apparently Ben had just collapsed one day, and when they took him to the hospital, they found out he had a pretty serious condition. Ping and I asked if we could visit him, but then the lady started to tear up, and we both knew what that meant. I asked if there was anything we could do, and the lady took us to another one of the employee-only areas and had us sign a card for Ben's family. I almost didn't want to, as I barely knew him, but I did it anyway. Ping and I didn't really feel like riding the go-karts anymore, so we walked around the mall a little bit, then went home. We texted Jeff what happened, and he was pretty sad too. This was about 5 years ago now, and I still think about what happened from time to time. It was just so unexpected, how I went from being terrified to making a cool friend to losing him 2 weeks later. Another thing is that meeting Ben and hanging out in that room might have been a part of the reason I decided to go into tech. I never met any of Ben's family members, but I hope they're doing well now. And maybe this sounds cliche, but I think this experience shows how fleeting friendships and life can be, and it's one more reason you should try to live every moment to the fullest.